Hi everyone, welcome to week 5 when we go over the second half of chapter 17 and ablatives absolute, plural, or the ablative absolute, singular. So we're going to talk about participles, just sort of review those from last week. We'll talk about the absolute in English, and then we'll take a look at ablative absolute. All right, just remember from last week that participles are verbal adjectives. They are verbs that act like adjectives or that are used as adjectives. So they'll come from verbs, but they'll have adjective features in that they'll have gender, number, and case, and more important, they will agree with a noun. All right. The 4 participles are listed with which endings they use. Present active is the only one that uses third declension. The other 3 use to or us endings. In ablative absolute, we're pretty much just going to be dealing with the first 2, the present active or the perfect passive. It's pretty rare for a future active to be in an ablative absolute, and I can't think of any future passives that have been in an ablative absolute. So we'll take a look at present active and perfect passive as they're used in the ablative absolute. All right. So English does have its own version of the ablative absolute. It's often called the nominative absolute, sometimes just an absolute phrase. The important thing about the ablative absolute or the absolute phrase in general, all right, is that it is going to describe the whole clause. It will not be grammatically connected to the whole clause. So in other words, that participle, which we know has to agree with a noun, is going to agree with a noun in its own phrase. It's not going to agree with a noun in the main clause. All right. So you can see that these are bolded and italicized, legs quivering, her arms folded across her chest, their fingers scraping the leftover frosting from the plates. These are all absolute expressions in English. And you can see that the main sentences, right, don't have anything to do with quivering. Legs quivering, our old dog Gizmo dreamed of chasing squirrels. So legs quivering is a self-contained grammatical unit. It does not agree with anything in the main clause, and it provides context or some sort of overarching description or detail for that main clause. Her arms folded across her chest, Professor Hill warned the class about the penalties of plagiarism. If I take out that absolute expression, I have a fully functioning sentence left. Professor Hill warned the class about the penalties of plagiarism. All right. In this case, with a passive verb, her arms folded across her chest, that just gives an extra detail, some extra context for the main clause. All right. And same in the third one. These are some other examples in English, these from kind of literary ones. You might recognize the Harry Potter one here. All right, Harry froze, his cut finger slipping on the jagged edge of the mirror again. So here's my participle, slipping. Of course, it agrees with finger. All right, and then everything else is just verbal elements that are added on. So his cut finger slipping, that's your base absolute expression, and then on the jagged edge and of the mirror again are both prepositional phrases going with them. All right, so I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can kind of read through them to get a better sense of how that absolute expression works. All right, here's one more page of English examples from literature, and again, you can kind of go through those and make sure you understand how the absolute expression works in English. All right, so just a little kind of quiz. All right, what is the absolute phrase in this sentence? Her kids tucked into bed. Jane could finally go to sleep. All right, what you should do, of course, is determine the main clause. What's our main idea with that main verb? And then what is the clause that's sort of giving a context or a little extra information? The sun shining bright. Jane knew it was going to be a great day. Same thing there. I'll give you a few seconds, and then I'll give you the answer. Feel free to pause at this point if you want a little more time. All right, so for number 2, A is the answer. All right, her kids tucked into bed. Jane could finally go to sleep. Take that off. Jane could finally go to sleep is a perfectly viable sentence, and the tucked into bed gives us some context. All right, the sun shining. Oh, actually, sorry about that. I thought they'd cut a word off, but C is the full nominative absolute. The sun shining bright. Jane knew it was going to be a great day. Again, Jane knew it was going to be a great day. Functions fine on its own. There's your sentence. the sun shining bright is add-on information. You'll note a couple things, and this will often be the case with Latin as well. These absolute expressions come at the beginning of the sentence, and they are set off by a comma. All right, those won't always be the case, but they are often the case. They can also come at the end of the sentence. They can, of course, come in the middle of the sentence. It is a little rarer, but usually they will be set off by commas wherever they appear in the sentence. All right, so here is the Latin version of it. So you have a Latin participle with a Latin noun in the ablative. We'll see that there are some times when you're going to have two nouns in the ablative or a noun and an adjective in the ablative with no participle, but the Latin participle plus the Latin noun in the ablative is by far the most common combination. All right, and here's your Latin noun and your Latin participle. Here's your Latin noun and your Latin participle, and you'll note that the first one, pueris visis, is that perfect passive participle that comes from the fourth principal part, and puellis currentibus is that present active participle that comes from the present stem and the second principal part with that nt as its sign. All right, the boys having been seen, there's your translation, the girls running. Okay, now here's the tricky part, or the part to sort of watch out for. As we saw in those English examples, remember that what you can't do with these fragments, if I were to say finish the sentence, what you can't do is say the boys having been seen ran away. All right, because now you're making boys the subject of that verb run, you're connecting it to the main clause. And as we talked about, that's exactly what you cannot do. All right, so what you need to do is have a fully self-contained sentence. The boys having been seen, the dog barked. All right, so now the boys having been seen is a contextual clue, contextual information that goes with that fully self-contained sentence, the dog barked. All right, same thing here, the girl's running. All right, the race was won. All right, so again, the race was won, fully self-contained sentence, functions on its own. All right, now the ablative absolute can be translated in a couple different ways. It can be translated as plain, the boys having been seen, as we saw in those examples above, and then we've got a different end of the sentence here, the mother rejoices. You can use with that ablative absolute. That kind of helps you know that it's not the subject. So if I have with the boys having been seen, all right, the mother rejoices, that with kind of prevents you from making the boys the subject. Because the boys had been seen, the mother rejoices. You can use these subordinate conjunctions, because, after, when, since, although, etc. Certainly something like although is going to need a specific context, but it is a possibility. All right, so Latin participle, Latin noun in the ablative can't be grammatically connected, to the main clause. All right, here are some practice phrases. All right, and note that you are giving both the literal and then a more colloquial, which is sort of everyday kind of translation. You can see that here in the example. So here's our with translation, and then here's our subordinate conjunction translation. So I'll do a couple for you, and then you can do the others on your own. So, Caesarea interfecto, because Caesar had been killed. You can also say with Caesar having been killed. And note that when you use one of those conjunctions, the when, since, because, etc., you're using a main verb in the clause, and when you use with, you're using that participial translation. I'll do number 2, which is a present active. Okay, so as the boys are singing. All right, canentibus, there's my present active participle. All right, so as the boys are singing, with the boys singing. All right, so you have a couple more than a couple more to practice on your own. Here are some actual texts to look at ablative absolutes in. All right, you can see the instructions at the bottom right. So in line 65, there's an ablative absolute. All right, and portante is my participle. There's that nt for the present active, and medio is my noun. All right, so this is the myth of Orpheus. Orpheus is the famous poet whose wife died very suddenly after a snake bite, usually on or near their wedding day. Orpheus was so distraught by his wife's death that he traveled to the underworld to get her out. He was able to persuade Hades, the god of the underworld, with his poetry, his singing, to agree to this. Hades put on the one stipulation that Orpheus could not look behind to see her until he got out of the underworld. And of course, just before he was out, he couldn't resist any longer, turned around, saw his wife, and then saw her being taken back to the underworld for good. He lost her forever. This is describing Cerberus, the three-headed dog that, of course, guards the underworld. And at this point, it's talking about Cerberus's neck, his heads, and saying with the middle neck, with the middle head, holding or having or carrying the chains, katanas' chains. All right, and then in line 67, there's another one, and again, pause to kind of figure it out on your own, and then, of course, I'll give you the answer. All right, so saxo aborto, that's going to be our ablative absolute. All right, aborto is from aborior, it's the fourth principal part. All right, and then with stone rising through the body. Ovid's Cerberus has the power of Medusa, whereby he can change people into stone. All right, tense and voice, portanta is present active, and aborto is perfect passive. All right, here's another one from an ancient Roman comedy. All right, 3 ablative absolutes in the above excerpt. Identify them and then translate the whole thing. And you've got, obviously, vocab there for you. All right, so pause if you want, and I will identify them. So, confecto prandio, vino ex poto, parasito excluso. Technically, 4 os part of it as well, but parasito excluso is the strict ablative absolute. All right. And then the translation, again, pause if you want. He brings the cloak to the tailor. All right, that's the frigionem. Once lunch was finished, prandio confecto. Once the wine was drunk, vino ex poto. And once the mooch, the parasite, was left outside. All right, and this is kind of a comic play about mistaken identity. So a twin brother had been kidnapped when he was young. In kind of mourning for the twin brother, the remaining twin, the non-kidnapped twin, his name was changed to the name of the kidnapped twin. So now I've got 2 people that look identical with the same name. The non-kidnapped twin is traveling the Mediterranean trying to find his long-lost brother. He unwittingly arrives in the town where his brother lives, and because they are identical twins with the same name, they are mistaken for each other throughout the course of the play until, of course, at the end, they are brought back together. All right, so let's take a look at this week's summatives. All right, here's the reading test, just a paragraph to translate. All right, this is the second half of the story of the Horatii and the Coriatii, who are fighting, the triplets, fighting on behalf of the state. Remember that when you're reading, read through the Latin first, kind of make mental notes about things you know, things you don't know, forms that are familiar, endings that are familiar. So, unus ex Horatiis integer fuit, et contra tres Coriatios statit. All right, so right off the bat, that os should be accusative. All right, if that's going to be accusative, that's likely trace is going to be accusative. Contra is a preposition. All right, that's going to make that a prepositional phrase. And note then, this takes care of my whole clause. And then I've just got et statit contra tres Coriatios. And he stood against the 3 Coriati, and that makes sense. All right, and then here, unus, nominative with that us ending. All right, one of the Horatii, one out of, but we in English would just say sort of one of. So one of the Horatii, fuit integer, was healthy, was unhurt. All right, so that should get you going. Continue with it. And then the writing summative. All right, and we're translating the Latin. So for things like this, all right, when their father walked into the field, do your best to use ablatives absolute. All right, so for instance, for since he loved his master, you could say the master having been loved, domino amato. All right. In number 3, about to tell a story, that's our future active, but you can see that this does agree with father, so it's not an ablative absolute, it's just a participle agreeing with the subject. All right, and I'll leave the rest for you. Have a good week. Please be in touch with any questions, and I will be here next week. Thanks.